Hey, again, this is Dr. Robert Melillo. This is the Melillo Method podcast, Everything Brain. As always, joined with Dr. Peter Scire, my friend, my colleague here. And this is something that, is a new venture for us, but it's exciting.
I'm excited to be back.
And actually, Matt, so this is Matt Wukasch. Matt is the CEO and on the board of directors and founder of the Interactive Metronome company. You are our first guest ever on our podcast.
Honored. So
years from now, in the archives, you will always have that distinction. So thank you for joining us. This one of the things that Peter and I are pretty passionate about is that there's so much information out there on the Instagram and on the Instagram. I sound old when I say that, right? The Instagram, on Instagram, media. On social media, on out there that TikTok people can pretty much say anything they want. And they may have no experience, have no idea what the hell they're talking about, but if they film it nice and they have a good voice and if they're dynamic, people listen. And in this world, especially now in the biohacking world, I think there's so many people out there that are just, out there saying stuff. And the majority of them, honestly, don't really know what they're talking about from a professional standpoint. As doctors with 20, 30 years of experience and working with thousands of patients and education and lecturing and doing research. And mostly what they're doing, really honestly, is they're kind of hawking products. And they're selling products because they're actually being sponsored by it. And, so they're making money off of it. And whether they actually use the product or really believe in the product, I think, some of them, maybe the higher level people do, but I think most of them probably don't. We're not going to do that, right? We're going to bring equipment and, people and technology that we actually know and use, and we know there's research, and we've used it for many years, and we really think that it has a benefit for people, especially if it can benefit them at home as well. So, one of the first things we thought of from the beginning was really Interactive Metronome, because it's a tool that I started using in 1998, I think, somewhere around there. You're going to talk about the story of the beginning of the company, and I know Peter's been using it really early on from the very beginning as he was starting to follow my work, because it was really foundational of what we do, and it still is in our centers, in our office, as part of the Melillo method. I mean, the Interactive Metronome is one of the key pieces. And if people ask us, what's the first thing we should get, of all the equipment that's out there that you use, we usually say, Interactive Metronome, that's it. So, I think that we wanted to bring that to people and really hear your story, talk about the product, but also really talk about the science underneath it, because to me, it's the part of the brain that people don't know. They don't understand. They don't really understand the way brain works, and they don't understand the importance of timing and synchronization in the brain, which is really everything. And that research really inspired me from the very beginning and really made me look for a tool that could actually train and change timing in the body and in the brain, and the relationship between motor development and movement and brain development. So, and I know, Peter and I both use this a lot, and we still use it every day with patients all around the world, right?
Yeah, I'm using it constantly.
Yeah. And with all different types of issues, small children, 80-year-old people. We use it at all different levels, from neurodevelopmental to neurodegeneration to brain injury, and it can even be used to just enhance people. Like if you're an athlete and you want to get better at what you do, it can be used that way. So Matt, welcome for being here with us. We thank you. It's really great having you here. I know coming up from Florida, coming to the big city on a super hot day.
Feel at home.
Yes, but so why don't you kind of give us a little of the story of how you founded Interactive Metronome, the company, and the technology and some of it underneath it.
Yeah. So, first of all, thanks for having me here, and it's an honor. I guess I didn't realize I was this first guest, because you kind of, in a sense, 20 years ago was our first guest, if you will. Mm-hmm. I remember coming to one of your first seminars you did in Connecticut, I believe.
Right. Yes.
And I got to tell you, it's since then we have like 45,000 clinicians that have gone through our certification process. I think we're in like 60 countries. And when we looked at, all of our files, if you will, that go up to the cloud, and then the estimation of how many hours people have used of the machine, we're like at 1 million people that have gone through our therapy.
Wow.
Over the last 20 plus years.
Yeah, that's amazing. When did it all start? I mean, what was the year it started and how did it start?
I think it started with an inventor, okay? And the inventor was a recording engineer in Detroit. James Castley was his name. He's a character. You know, Janis Joplin, he was like on some big album recordings, right? And I guess when you do recordings, I'm not an expert at this, but the band never plays together. So if a band is on stage, they will speed up and slow down together based on all sorts of cues. And when you're in a studio, it's a different animal. And so you have something called a click track. And everyone has to stay to this beat, this click track. And it made him crazy when people would get off that beat. And so what he thought, hey, if I have a box that listens to the person versus relative to the click track, a light will come on one side of the box and tell you if you're early, and a light will come on the other side of the box if you're late. And he built one of these things, and it didn't work. It was marginally effective. And then he said, well, what if I provide an auditory, a guide tone, if you will, so that when the only person that can hear it is the musicians in the headphones, like these. And if you hit early, if you're hitting ahead of the click track, you'll hear a tone in your left ear. And if you hit a little bit late behind the click track, you'll hear another tone in the right ear. And when he did that, almost immediately, it changed people's behavior, as musicians, okay, who already had really good timing to begin with.
Right.
Okay? So that was his thing. That was his invention, if you will. And I don't know the story 100% where it went next, other than one of my mentors, one of my good friends, his first son, who's my godson, was born without a leg. He was born neurologically really challenged and had a lot of problems. Fed through a tube almost for 2 years. The kid shouldn't have lived. And but Jimmy is his name. He's a fighter. And so at 7 years old, Jimmy was still crawling around on the floor and he was, by the way, it was a knee down, okay, prosthetic. And he couldn't use it. He couldn't walk with it. No chance. So this inventor somehow was a friend of the music therapist that would come once a week to Jimmy Eggleston's house, right? And so she brought the inventor, James Castley, in, and they brought the box. And they sat with Jimmy, and the first thing they did was get Jimmy to try to clap to a beat with his hands. And Jimmy had no conception of timing or
How
rhythm.
old was he at that time?
7
years old
yeah.
at the time, okay.
So here he is, just trying to figure out there's this reference beat that's going to come around every second, basically, and you have to plan, you have to anticipate, and then motor coordinate and get your hands to clap at the same time. And after several weeks of that, he started really getting it. He started understanding the beat. And then they had him in a seating position with his good leg, started to work on like dorsiflexion, rocking back and forth to a beat, that same beat. And I guess, in short order, they had him standing up with the prosthetic leg and then trying to do the same motion with his good leg with the prosthetic leg. Because, walking is a very rhythmic, a very symmetrical activity, right?
Absolutely.
So here he is. He's got the three-sided walker, got the prosthetic leg on. He's rocking back and forth. And I remember getting the call. I worked in aerospace. Okay, I have a engineering degree. I'm not a therapist. I'm an engineer. I got a master's in finance from Purdue. I was working for an aerospace company, and I get the call from his dad and said, Matt, you cannot believe it. Jimmy is walking. I mean, he's not running or anything, but he's walking around, and he's in the last basically month and a half, 2 months, has made more gains from this crazy contraption than he has in his whole 7 years of life. So I'm like, wow. And then I get another call a week later. He said, because he was a big CEO for a big Fortune 50 company. And he says, I paid a guy, an attorney, to go see if there's any prior art on this. And there was no patents on this. And he says, I'm doing it. I'm gonna patent this thing, and I'm at a stage in my life where I can't go commercialize it. I can't go help other Jimmys, but I got a guy that needs to do this. Could you be that guy?
He's got a guy.
Could you be that guy? And I'm like, holy smokes, I've been with this company. I'm flying high. I mean, I'm moving up through this organization. I can see my future, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, but maybe this is the move. Maybe it's time to take a risk and go help Jimmy's. Even financially, it doesn't work out. I'm going to help some Jimmy's, some others.
American dream. Start your own company in the
Yeah.
United States, you know what I mean?
Yep.
Be your own boss and make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what year would this have been?
This was 96, 97. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I quit my job. They couldn't believe it. But when I told them what the mission was, everybody was supportive. And then, thank God, my wife was making a lot of money at the time. So I worked for the first couple of years, no dough, no salary, no anything.
And how old were you at the time?
Don't ask. I don't know. Probably I was in my late 30s, early 40s kind of thing, right?
Okay.
So then, what do? I got to get this thing not in the big black box. We got to get this to work on a computer.
Right.
And so I went and I lived in Detroit at this developer's house, basically in his basement during the week. I'd fly there to Detroit from Florida every week, live with him. And he was a cool guy. He was a good guy. But anyhow, we developed the first software version of Interactive Metronome, okay? The whole user interface, the whole everything, how it worked. And James Castle was still alive at the time, and he had a lot of input in that. And when we actually sold it to some clinicians, and they were using it, mostly kind of just word of mouth. It's actually kind of fuzzy to me how we actually got anyone to purchase this thing. The triggers were terrible. We made them in a garage, basically. And so what ultimately happened, though, there was two things going on simultaneously. We realized, like, depending on which computer you had, because we're talking like, Windows 95 kind of thing. This is the era we're talking about. So the early users, we had to even teach them how to create a file using DOS kind of thing, right? And I don't know how but I could tell when we got on one computer, it acted different than if you put it on the other computer. And so then we got on the oscilloscope. We started measuring this thing. And we're like, oh my gosh, this thing is so off. Like, the Windows environment couldn't even keep a steady beat. So sometimes it'd be 60 beats a minute, sometimes it'd be 54 beats a minute. It was all over the place. And then if you add your clap where you were early or late, it could be 25, 30 milliseconds off the beat. Mm-hmm. So we're like, man, as a measuring tool, this is, we're kind of basically playing horseshoes. We're not dialing this thing in, right?
Yeah.
So we really quickly understood we needed our own dedicated circuit of some sort, that we take it out of the computer environment.
Yeah, I think it's a good time because people listening, they're hearing this, but now I think they need to have somebody explain to them actually what the interactive metronome does, how it works, and when you're talking about triggers and late and early.
Yeah.
I think Peter would be a great person to explain that. So why don't you explain to people like kind of the practical usage of the interactive metronome?
Yeah, so as Matt said, I mean, they're hearing a steady beat, and usually that beat is at a rate of 54 reps per minute. So they got a headset on, and they're just hearing this cowbell sound. And initially, when you're evaluating a patient, all that you're hearing is just a steady cowbell sound. And let's say we place a hand clicker, and we put it on one of their hands, and we maybe ask them to do just a circular movement. And now the goal of the interactive metronome is, okay, can I clap in synchronization with that reference tone?
Yeah.
Right.
And then you created the computer program where, as you said, that now am I, in terms of milliseconds, able to differentiate, am I early or late relative to the reference tone?
Yeah, and let me clarify that, because when you say a millisecond, just so everyone listening here kind of can get their brain around this, no one can stay on the beat.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 milliseconds in a second, right?
Yeah.
This machine measures microseconds. So if you're, milliseconds ahead or behind the beat, that's like ultimately, like, even great athletes don't have perfect timing.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it in where I've had some musicians in my facility come down and work on it, and they've been some of the best I've ever seen. But you take average Joe person, the average Joe person is probably 150, 200 milliseconds away from the reference tone initially until we start obviously training into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's important because the brain operates on the millisecond, and sub-millisecond time scale, at least that we know of, right? So that's important because we're trying to change the brain, and so we need to do something that actually works in the way and on the time frame that the brain works, which is...
Yeah, and what makes this device so amazing is that, when we're looking at a timing mechanism in the brain, or, obviously from a neurological perspective, we can look at imaging studies and we can look at fMRI studies, and we can look at other different imaging, but something to have so practical in the moment to be able to measure a time interval to the processing output of the brain. That's what makes this device so incredible, is that you can, like we've talked about, you can say, hey, you have a stroke patient, or you have a brain injury patient, or you have a child with a developmental disorder. Something in this moment so easy to do. We don't have to rely on something that like an imaging study to do that.
But the interactive part is what makes all the difference, right? Because there are people out there and they'll use metronome apps, or they'll use some sort of timing. And, we'll do that with people or kids that aren't ready for it, where, again, they're trying to clap and you're trying to coach them, let's say, or even do hand over hand, and you listen to a beat. But you have no actual feedback.
Right.
You don't know, are you... I mean, I just had a woman yesterday who's, a nurse practitioner, a very, very bright woman, and she came in the office, and this is one of the assessments we do, because it starts with an assessment that actually has an objective assessment that has data that you've collected over years, and you can compare based on age and, is this where this person should be? So there's normative data on it.
Right.
So we know, how a person this age, let's say, should be about this far from the beat,
range.
right, within the norm. And that really is important, because without that, then how do we know? So this woman, I was sitting down reviewing the results with her, and she was like, man, I feel like I nailed that interactive metronome. And she was at like 250 milliseconds. And she was like, oh my God.
She gave her the bad news.
I was like, that's the whole point. She thought she was right on. Like, she was like, I nailed it. Like, I'm in rhythm,
Yeah, so what's a right on? A right on is at 15 ms or to 0.
Yeah.
So, to be 250 milliseconds out, or even some people that you see 400 milliseconds or 600 milliseconds. So
and the norm is, like, as we talked about last night, is it really kind of below 40 milliseconds for most people, right in that range, right? And so to be 250, and this is a woman who's, she had a concussion, brain injury, but, she was fully functional, very, very bright. But you can't tell. So the fact that it interacts with you and tells you too fast, too slow, slow down, speed up, that's what makes all the difference, because that's how you change the speed of your movement, which literally changes the brain and changes behavior.
Well, so then so we're talking about two things that the machine or that our technology does, though, right? The first thing is, like you talk about norms, right? It's an assessment tool. The human capacity of timing, what is that? It's kind of like, it's all about timing. We use that phrase all the time. But this thing, as an engineer, this is why I fell in love with it, because it's empirical. You can measure someone's timing, okay, as it relates to this motor activity.
Right.
And one of the first studies actually done, which was in Effingham, Illinois, they took 600 kids and put them through an early version of our tech, okay? And the kids were between the ages of 6 and 10. 600 kids, okay? They didn't get any feedback other than, here's this beat, we want you to use clap both hands, right hand, left hand. That's it. There were some really interesting observations that were just totally clear. One was, a 7-year-old is better than a 6-year-old. An 8-year-old is better than a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
All the way up to 10. They're getting better at
There's
whatever this thing is.
There's a developmental trajectory to it, so, and that's really important.
So then, but what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? So then he looked at the California Achievement Test. They looked at their grades in school. They had these like rating scales that the teacher and the parents did. And those kids you were talking about, these high scores, these kids that were outside the norm for their age. These were the wonky kids. These were the kids that weren't keeping up with their peers, academically, weirdly enough, socially. On the rating scales, I was really focused on that. And that's another thing that when I first got involved with Interactive Metronome in the discovery, through smart guys like doctors like yourself, was like, how in the world can this, a clapping machine not only makes someone more coordinated, because that's what you're watching this motor activity, but all of a sudden now you're talking about all these cognitive changes, and social is one of them. You know, working memory is like the thing we hit it out of the park with, and you can talk about working memory all day. But that's really important for reading and reading comprehension and things like that. And that's our secret sauce. We really hugely affect working memory. But so then the real question is then, if you can measure this capacity and you can identify outliers, if you improve this capacity, can you change them for the better? You know, so they can catch up.
Right.
And that's where you guys are.
Yeah.
You know, last night talking with you at dinner, I realized that, you know, you're kind of at a different level even of how you use our technology relative to, I would say, the wider audience of like speech therapists and occupational therapists and physical therapists.
Yeah. Well, we talk about all the time. There are great tools out there, you know, all different types of tools. It's not about the tool, it's how you use it. And most people have no idea how to use a tool. You know, they'll take, let's say, laser or infrared or whatever and put it all over the head and think they're actually doing something when, you know, when you're talking about changing the brain, you might actually be making things worse. So that's the whole thing. We look at tools and we're like, okay, how do we actually use this? And that's actually my story from the beginning was I, you know, really had started my journey really because of my own son's diagnosis or labeling of ADHD or something like that, right? And I started really diving into the research and started compiling what later became my textbook and trying to figure out. And really the questions that were foundational for me was, you're talking about behavior, right? You're talking about social behavior and this behavior. And I remember I was thinking and I was saying, well, what is behavior in the brain? Like, what does it actually look like? Like, what does a thought look like in the brain? What is behavior? And then even a more basic question is, you know, what is a brain and where do brains come from? Like, when did a brain develop on this world in evolution and why? Why did it evolve? It evolved for a reason. And then I was doing a lot of research around there. And in the early 90s, that was when Bill Clinton called the decade of the brain. So all of this new type of imaging data where we could really look at the brain in real time and really look at the way the brain actually operates on a millisecond or sub-millisecond level and look at it and see it and time it, record it with things like, you know, EEG and computers at a whole nother level. And so there was this whole concept of functional connectivity that really became prominent, which really still is prominent in neuroscience. That's like the foundation of it. And it was all about, it's not about a lesion or an injury or damage between wires. It's about the way things communicate. And it really comes down to timing. And there was one researcher in particular, a guy named Rodolfo Linus, originally from Columbia, but was at NYU. And he was just, for me, like unbelievable. I mean, his stuff was just amazing. He eventually wrote a book called Eye of the Vortex, which is foundational. I told you about it last night. You have to read it. And he talked about, you know, evolution of the brain and that it was driven by movement, by motricity, by movement. The fact that a living thing moved and had to move with a purpose is what created the necessity for a brain. And so brains developed as a byproduct of movement. Because if you're a plant and you're in the ocean and you're not moving, you don't really need a brain, right? But as soon as you start to move, there's a choice to be made. Do I move that way or this way? And so therefore, you have to actually have some sort of way of prediction of the outcome of the choice you make. So you have to make a choice, but then you have to, which really is the beginning of imagination. You have to literally get a sensory motor image, even at the most basic animal life form, and say, if I do this, is that going to be better than doing this? Because otherwise it's not beneficial and it won't evolve. Natural selection will weed it out, right? If it's random. So there had to be some way, and that's the foundation of thinking. And that's the foundation of the brain and cognition and behavior. And right from the very beginning, you have a choice. Do I go towards, do I approach, or do I avoid? And so from the very beginning, that's the two foundations of any behavior and human behavior, approach and avoidance. It's also the foundation of the two hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere is approach, the right hemisphere is avoid, is withdrawal. And that is the way they operate. That's the most basic foundational function, and it really starts with that movement and that motor activity. So I was looking at all of this, and this was going through my head, and I'm looking for tools, and I'm developing my method about how to work with kids and treat them. I'm getting really good results, and the hemispheric balancing thing, which really, to me, came down to timing between the hemispheres and networks in the brain. And I remember sitting in my office one day, like I said, I think it was around 1998, and I'm thinking, Jesus, if there was something that you could really measure timing and change timing, there's got to be a tool that can do that. And I remember my associate at the time was a guy named Dr. Mike Trayford, still a good friend of ours. He's a great guy. He's a doctor down in North Carolina. And he was younger than me. He was a young guy, and I wasn't really great with computers back then. And he went on something called the internet, which I didn't really know much about at the time.
Interweb.
He went on the line, right? And he came back and he said, hey, there's this thing called the Interactive Metronome, and it's exactly what you're talking about. And I said, get out of here. And I looked at it, I went, whoa. And I got the number, I called it right away. And I remember, I don't know if I talked to you or I talked to somebody, and I said, I want to get this. And I said, tell me how it works. And I said, I want to buy this. Yeah. And I think someone on the other line said, why?
I think probably me.
And I said, well, because, timing. It's the way, I work with kids and developmental issues and brain. And I said, this is really, I think, really foundational. And he said, well, we don't really exactly know why it works. And I said, I know why it works. And he said, really? I said, yeah, I do. I think I have an idea of how it works and how you're changing timing and what that relates to and how it changes behavior. And he said, really? Can I hear more about it? And then eventually, that's when you said, can we come to one of your lectures and listen to what you do?
That sounds, it's like you're recreating our first conversation that I don't recall, but it had to be me because that's how I approached I was like, I don't know. We don't know what's going on.
And I was like, and you were like, well, I want to hear from you. Like, tell me how it works, And then you came to the lecture I did in Connecticut, which is the first time I did my course, which we're going to be doing tomorrow. So we've been doing that, since then. And, I remember you sat there and you said to me, wow, I had no idea. Nobody is talking about this like this quite, and that, was kind of the beginning of in your journey and my journey. And then it's been great because you've been really supportive. You've helped us with research. We've done some research that involved, interactive metronome. And so it's been a great relationship over the years, and you've really evolved it. And really what they do now, like the tools, the computer gamification of it and everything is beautiful.
As you're sitting here listening, the serendipitous of the fact that in the mid-90s, he's doing this, he's got this tool, and then it's coinciding with the decade of the brain. And at that point, the movement in the neuroscience community was really looking at an area of the brain called the cerebellum. And so here you are, got this tool that requires the cerebellum to activate these different regions of the brain, and we can watch in real time how this particular area of the brain is working in concert with other regions of the brain, hence why you're talking about, we get these children to improve their timing and their executive functions go up, or we see changes in their behavior, or we see development in their social pragmatic skills. And so that was really, in the mid-90s, there was just a huge explosion, and at the time in that research was this concept of motor cognitive binding, that cognition sits on top of the functional timing of the motor system. And if there was these breaks in this timing that we could obviously clearly see on the metronome when you're asking a person to do some type of synchronized movement and they're way off this beat, okay, and their auditory system can't modulate and say, okay, hey, come back on beat. And so, it was just, and you're sitting here and you're going, okay, this is like a perfect tool that you stumble upon. Totally stumbling upon, right? And then at the same time, the literature is going that way.
That's crazy, right?
And now, looking back on this 25 plus years, again, this is why this is probably the best tool out there.
20 years, but I'm still learning. Like even last night at dinner, I had to process. No, you said it a different way today. Again, I'm thinking about the seaweed. It doesn't need a brain, right? It goes with the flow.
Yep.
Interactive metronome. There's every time that beat comes around, there is a feedback mechanism that says you're doing good or you're not doing so good, right? So the reward, if you will, or the decision making that you were talking about with someone with a brain about what to do motorically, it's just, you know, hundreds and hundreds of repetitive decisions, even though it's kind of the same one, but it has a consequence. You know, you're ahead or you're behind, and are you getting better? Are you getting reward sounds? Those kinds of things. And that completely follows that model.
Sure,
you know,
it's
in terms of-
multi-sensory. You're engaging multiple parts of the brain because it's visual, it's auditory, it's movement, it's tactile, and there's feedback. And so you can modify your behavior. You can modify it. And that really, so when we talk about, what is thinking? What is a thought? Which is the foundation of behavior, of anything.
Yeah.
It really comes down to, as Peter was talking about, this thing called cognitive binding. This is what Rodolfo Linus really was the founder of, really understanding, is that, we have a metronome-like device in our brain. It's called a thalamus. This is where all sensory input comes into, and then it's fed into the different areas of the brain. So we hear and see and feel all these different things happening in our body. And he says that basically the brain is a reality emulator, meaning we're taking what we're perceiving in our world as reality, it's coming in our brain and somehow being reconfigured into that we actually had this image. But they all come through different channels. So sound comes through one channel, vision comes through another channel, smell, movement, gravity, all of that's coming in, and they go to different areas of the brain. And so the question was, how does that all come together, right? Because a thought has all of that. Yeah. You don't hear something and see it in a different way. You blend it all together. You bind it. And how does it all become bound? And it has to be bound in time. Time is the glue that binds all of these areas of the brain together. And the thalamus is the metronome in the brain that in either side of the brain, separately in the hemispheres, they're oscillators that are constantly, the brain is constantly pulsing on and off all the time.
Is that the little brain?
No, the cerebellum is what you're calling the little brain,
okay.
Right? And so there's a link with the cerebellum, which is kind of the body, and there's a timing mechanism for the motor system.
Got it.
Because same thing, we have a metronome in our motor system that helps coordinate our movements, and then that was kind of transformed into a timing mechanism in our brain. And the foundation of consciousness and thought and everything really is based on that timing and that rhythm. And that's when we talk about brain waves, going from theta, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma. It's really how fast is that thalamus or other parts of the brain oscillating, and it's creating different brain waves at different speeds. But then that's being superimposed on a main brain wave, which is called a gamma brain wave, and that links it all together. And so the idea that the brain, there's so many brain cells and they're so far apart that we think that all the brain cells are talking to one another together. But that's impossible. It would take too long, and you have 100 billion brain cells. The way that they actually communicate, so if I have sound and vision and light and tactile and different things happening on one side of the brain, and then I have a different thing kind of happening in this side of the brain and it's being processed differently, how do I get that all together? And it happens through time. Time is what binds them together, not actually physical connections. It's they get bound in space, and then as a thought, they kind of get frozen in time, and that's what a memory is, right? Literally, we have a phase, it's like the brain takes a picture of it, and that pattern of that electrical activity is your memory. And then when you call up your memory and you light up all these different areas, at a certain point, boom, it all comes together and you're like, oh, that memory. And so if you can't coordinate those things, then you can't learn as well. You can't form memory. And the more areas of the brain that we can bring together at the same time, the more mature we are, the smarter we are. So in children, there's a developmental trajectory. When they're small, they don't move really quickly. They're a little clumsy. They look like little drunk people, right? And they don't have great muscle tone yet. And their brain waves are very slow. 0 to 2, they have brain waves that are primarily in the delta range, and which is 0 to 2 hertz, which is very slow. And then as they get to like 3 to 5, they're in the theta range. And then above the age of 6, they start getting some alpha into their brain, which is 8 to 10 hertz, which is the operation of the motor system. And the cerebellum is at that frequency. So again, this is frequencies, is what we're talking about. Frequency is timing. It's all about that. And then that evolves and that matures. And what we've been able to show in our research is when we're looking at anything out there that is neurodevelopmental and mental health and anything, which is basically everything is developmental, that it really comes down to this developmental trajectory, so that we know, like, people with schizophrenia and bipolar, they have a lot of slow waves. Why? Because their brain is still immature. And their movements are kind of clumsy. Why? Because their brain is still kind of immature. And their timing is slow and their timing is poor. So when you can change the timing in the brain, you're changing that foundational issue. But you have to create a balance between the timing, and that's the issue. You have to speed up one side, slow down the other, and get them to kind of match, which is what we do and what we use your tool to do.
Yeah,
so that's really the foundation of everything that we do in the brain, everything that we think of. It all comes down to that coordination and timing, which is really fascinating. And it starts in the motor system. And the thing that makes humans most unique is bipedalism. And according to Owen Lovejoy, the leading expert in the world on the science of bipedalism, the difference to be able to walk upright is all about synchronization and timing within the motor system. Like, we have a more coordinated timing in our body than any other animal, which allows us to walk upright. And we have to have a brain that was more coordinated to do that.
Yeah, and in a sense more intelligent. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where it grew out of. Cognition grew out of that movement. It came from it, which, in the old days, these early thoughts, when people started talking about that, back in the 1890s, when neurology was just starting to become a thing, and, people said that there was some relationship to thought, and that the brain and the biology of the brain, people at the time said, no, we think different than animals just because God made us different, and it was just a God-given gift. It had nothing to do with biology. You can't equate us to animals. But then eventually, people came out, like Darwin and other people, and showing that it really was an evolutionary thing, and that it really, the main difference was in cognitive is it emerged out of the way we move differently, and that was related to one another.
Well, so my journey has been so. Even now, when I'm hanging in there with this company, why I still keep doing this and still get great joy from it, is the discovery of what is going on under the hood. Different people have all. The early days. I was listening to you when your story you just gave me a minute ago. There was a kid going to see Dr. Stanley Greenspan, who was like an autism specialist. He out of Bethesda. He had this whole
the floor time guy.
Yeah,
right. The
so
floor time
every
guy.
kid develops basically the same way. And one of the biggest signs of like weeding out a kid and getting early intervention for a kid with autism is if they try to skip a step that all the other kids are doing, or if their timing is off.
Which is something that we are really big proponents of, and we say all the time, and which now, traditional medicine is saying that doesn't matter anymore, by the way, right? They're saying that, like, crawling isn't even a milestone anymore, which is crazy, right?
Crazy.
This is post-COVID crazy world. But yes, so Greenspan knew that, and we've talked about that from the very beginning, and we teach it all the time, what we call a developmental brain blueprint.
Yes.
But now understand that traditional pediatricians and people are saying that that's no longer important, which is crazy.
I didn't know that was a thing right now, but he used a term called planning and sequencing, which I'd never heard before. But he goes, if this tool can actually measure that, and you can weed these kids out that are not neurotypical, the kids that are 2-3 standard deviations away from what a 10-year-old put on the machine should be doing, then we gotta fix that. And so I can help you design studies that will support your efforts. And so in the beginning, the early days, we kind of focused on kids with developmental issues. Then we started doing neurotypical kids, like high school level, and we were moving the needle on those kids, right?
Sure.
So here are these kids that already know how to read, but when they went through a pretty aggressive IM program, in a big high school, Flanagan High School, these kids had like a 7% improvement in their reading comprehension and broad reading, which is a Woodcock-Johnson test. And the guy who was designing the study, he was the co-author of the Woodcock-Johnson, okay?
Wow.
And he thought this has got to be snake oil.
Right.
And now he's on our scientific advisory board. It's Kevin McGrew is his name. And he's a great guy. And so we learned from that. And he said, well, let's do that same study, but let's do it with 10-year-olds, okay? And then, the effect size. So the effect size wasn't that great on the kids that already knew how to read.
Right.
But when you did it on young kids that were just learning to read, think about what reading is. Decoding. So now you got to see a symbol, D-O-G, and you got to put that together and create the word dog, right? And there are kids, like you're talking about these snapshots you're talking about. Working memory versus long-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
That ability to retrieve D-O-G as one thing, dog, and not have to phonetically, I got to decode with my eyes, I got to sound it out with phonemes in my brain, and then make that dog. And then I got to do the next word and the next word, and now I have a whole sentence, and I kind of forgot what the first word was. But the more quickly I can do that, the more fluent I can do that.
Right.
And you can tease out working memory as it relates to how your decoding is versus auditory decoding versus, the different sensory system decodings. And you can time those things. And that's where we knocked it out of the park. This idea of like the C-top and the tower tests, which are the biggest predictor of kids' ability to read, we moved the needle like over 20%.
Oh, you're impacting the reading network.
Yeah.
And now we understand the mechanisms that are happening between the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the parietal lobe on the left-hand side, and how it's then feed-forwarding to the front part of the brain, the left frontal cortex. But that's all dependent upon the input coming in from the right cerebellum. Okay. So here we are, back to proprioceptive input being fired by this timing activity.
Yeah.
Okay, so now as we're firing the motor system and we're bringing that motor system into that sensory motor rhythm through the cerebellum and other parts of the brainstem, they're now going to fire across to the contralateral hemisphere and create those timing frequencies. Because when you look at a person who, let's say, is not a good decoder, okay, what does that mean? What does that mean to the person? Is that, well, here I am, I have to pick up the difference between sh versus ch, okay, from an auditory aspect. Or I'm looking at the paper and I'm going, okay, B looks this way and D looks this way. Okay, how fast does my visual system recognize those differences in the letters? Okay,
that's exactly
so now
right.
I have to recognize the difference in the letter, also recognize the difference in the pronunciation, the sound, or the phenome. Okay, but that's all coming through the timing speed of the cerebellum communicating to the reading network. Okay, and so hence why, again, you could sit there and you can try to, like for me, in my early experience, was just try, hey, you got to read and read and read and read. Imagine if I had a metronome activity when I was struggling with my learning disability, how fast I would have been able to change that computational speed of my brain.
Yeah, it's like non-specific. It doesn't. The domain is non-specific. I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? Because you're not really working on reading. You're working on this foundational thing that then when you go and practice reading, it improves.
Well,
which
you
is
actually,
really
you stumbled onto a funny word.
You actually just used a term.
It's called
in the thalamus, there are different nuclei that are specific for things like vision and hearing and other sensory input. But then there's the non-specific nuclei.
Yeah.
And so what happens is the non-specific nuclei creates the timing of the brain. And then these other things go through their specific channels, and then those specific areas come to threshold, but then they're bound together by the non-specific, and that makes the whole thing, right? And so, as you're saying, like if you see a symbol, right, that's one channel, and that's traveling at a certain speed, and then you're hearing sound, and that has to travel at a certain speed, and somehow the brain needs to be able to bring that together so the sound and the letter are actually at the same time. Because if you have the wrong sound with the wrong letter, you can't read. And so again, and this is all what we call bottom up, right?
Yeah.
So it comes from the body, from the movement, from the sensory system up to the brain. Reading is what's called a top-down type of thing. So to change these bottom-up problems, you can't use top-down methods.
Right.
So getting a kid to read that's dyslexic,
That's huge.
You can't change that through more reading.
Right.
Right? And so one of the things that, again, the big misconception out there is people are told that, well, dyslexia is a lifelong problem that you can't change. That's BS. We've changed it tens of thousands of times because we know what the foundational problem is. It's not a cognitive problem. It really starts with their timing, their rhythm, their motor system. And again, and I can tell you that one of the biggest tools that I tell parents, I said, when we change this timing, you're going to see the change in academics you're going to have a completely different child, completely different kid. And even with people, I remember when, because as a practitioner, I had to go through the training, right? We all had to do that. And I remember it's like, I don't know, 50,000 reps you're doing or something,
We
right?
had to do a lot, yeah.
It's 50,000 reps. How many people do 50,000 reps of anything, right?
Yeah.
And I remember as I was doing it, I was always pretty sharp, but I remember I was like, I felt it. Like it was one of the few things, like I felt like my brain was operating at a whole different speed level.
Yeah.
Like there was no hesitation in like, what's that word? Or it was like instantaneous. And I felt it. I felt it in myself as I went through it.
So tell me this, because then, let's look at the full spectrum, right? So as a company, and we can talk about business and why we are where we are today, because we have a certain product form. It's built to be delivered by a therapist, and it works primarily on people with problems, right? But we do know there's a lot of literature and a lot of research using our technology that says it makes people that are good at sports and things like that better, right?
Even better. Yeah.
We have golf study. We have multiple golf studies. We have people in soccer. These European studies are out there. We don't have a product form for that yet because it needs to be like consumed like a consumer product. And but it doesn't mean it doesn't have impact. And I think that's probably worth, even just out of curiosity, to talk about this on the podcast. Like, explain to me why. Okay, real quickly, the golf study showed that when golfers went through IM training, their golf shot accuracy improved. Statistically, there was no doubt, right? This is out of Michigan. I forget which Michigan college it was, but anyhow, but what they also observed was the better golfer actually got a greater improvement. Now, why was that? And they theorized that the person that had the more consistent golf swing to begin with, the fundamentals were good. What they really were lacking is this consistency, this ability to replicate their best game over and over and over. But how does that now relate to what we're talking about here with people with problems?
Well, you look at the brain, as Dr. Melillo alluded to. So you even with it, like a memory, it creates this timing effect. Okay, so as you're doing a physical activity, you're also creating these sensory maps that exist in the parietal lobe, and also exist in the cerebellum. And so what you're doing is you're already taking this map that's already been laid down. Now imagine if I can create this better timing mechanism that happens all the time. That, hey, it's like when we both played sports and you're sitting there and you're finally like got this swing and you've worked on your baseball swing and like I got it. Right, but how do I reproduce it all? So I think it comes back down to, do you change that integration rate in the cerebellum that says, hey, you already got this plan, it's there, we know it's there, but now I'm going to make it just more precise that it's happening. That plan is coming online all the time in a very consistent way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and anybody who's played golf knows it's all about timing, right?
Yeah.
And it's not about power. I remember years ago, many years ago, I dated a young woman who was one of the top golfers in the country. And she was, maybe 5'6", like 105 pounds. And, I'd go out, I'm 6 feet of, 190 pounds. And we go out and we play, and I would be trying to kill the ball and would go maybe, 200 yards. And she would like easy, slow, like it looked no effort, and she would hit it like 250.
Straight and further.
And I'd be like, how does that happen? And so everybody knows that it's really all about that precision of timing. It's how you coordinate different parts of your body. So just like we said, we coordinate different parts of our brain to come together at the exact same moment of time. On, again, the millisecond, hundreds of millisecond time scale. When we can make parts of our body come together, exactly as close as it possible, we harness that energy and that speed, and you get so much more out of it. And that's where the accuracy comes in, because what would cause inaccuracy if I think my body's one place, but it's actually another. Or if I think one part of my body is going at certain speed and the other part of my body's going at a different speed, then where my club is going to be is not where I think it's going to be. And that goes down, like Peter's talking about, these maps we have in our brain, particularly in the right side of our brain. We have to know really precisely where our body is. And so the more that we can coordinate that, the more we can rally these all together and do it and reproduce it exactly as we've imaged it in our brain, is when we're going to have more power, length, and accuracy.
And back to that millisecond component that he's talking about is like the same thing as referring back to the dyslexics. Okay, so the dyslexic takes that sh or ch sound, and they're hearing it at 300 millisecond intervals or 400 millisecond intervals, when in fact that interval should be somewhere under 100 milliseconds. So here we are with the interactive metronome, able to quantify that, okay? And that's what we've done in all the years of working with these kids for 30 years now, is be able to sit there and go, hey, your child has this decoding level or has this phonological awareness level. How is that happening in the brain? Well, here's why. Because I just did this long form assessment, this 14 different exercises, and your child's processing speed is, let's say, at 300 milliseconds off from the normative time. And then comparatively, then we can get this relationship of, hey, what's happening with the right side of the body, comparing it to the left hemisphere, or the left hemisphere's control of the right side of the body, and vice versa. And now we can see that asymmetry and difference, which again for us was a huge breakthrough in how we're going to rehab these kids.
That kind of summarizes what's unique about our work, my work, what we started, and the whole point of the Melillo method was that it's not just about timing in the brain and speeding it up. It's about the balance of timing in the brain, and the right brain and left brain have different oscillators, so they can get out of sync with one another. The right thalamus can be oscillating at a different level than the left thalamus, which means that two sides of the brain, one side of the brain is much faster than the other, and we can't bring that together. And so what we see is one side might be too fast or much faster than it should be or more mature, and the other side can be really too slow. So it's not just about, that we have to change the timing and the speeding. People talk about kids with dyslexia or learning disabilities have auditory processing disorders or what does that mean, processing disorder? It comes down to a problem with speed, but what we know is that it's not just a deficit of processing, it's an imbalance. So for instance, there's been studies on dyslexics that show that they have a deficit in what's called local processing, which is really left brain processing, looking at details, looking at things that come really fast and really quick. But they're better than most people on global processing, what the right brain does, seeing the big picture, putting it all together
visual spatial
at one, right? Whereas people with autism are the exact opposite. Uta Frith out of Cambridge showed this, that there was a problem with processing where kids with autism had a great advantage for local processing details. You can get a kid with autism come in this room and they'll see a speck of paper on the floor that none of us would see, and they'll be able to zoom in on it. But they have a great deficit of global processing, which is right brain processing. And so it's not just about, bringing it up so that they have a deficit on one side but an advantage on the other. And that's the problem. So it isn't just about let's just speed up the whole brain. No, you have to slow down one side, bring up the other. You have to bring them together. And so that's where we use it, where we may work specifically speeding up one side of the brain, and then that works to actually slow down the other side of the brain. But also when you're bringing your hands together, if you want to bring them in the middle and you're not moving your body in the same way, but you want to meet in the middle, and I have different tone on one side than the other, to get in the middle, I have to move one hand faster and one hand slower to meet in the middle, right? Because this hand, let's say it's normally moving faster because I have better tone and I have better awareness, and this side's moving slower. If I'm moving them together, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna be one side or the other. One side's gonna be faster than the other.
So what you're saying is outwardly the motor, the activity you see with the left hand and right hand is somehow tied to the left and right brain? It's not like one side of the brain is doing both hands?
No, the right hand is more related to the left side of the brain, and the left hand is more related to the right side of the brain. Not only from the movement control, but the sensory feedback.
Got it.
Because again, not only is the interactive metronome changing the motor, but it's also, you have to change the feedback of where your limbs are and how fast they're moving, where they are in space, so that you know how to control the motor output. So you're working on both ends of it, and the left side of the
absence of an injury. This is absence of a brain injury or patient with TBI or concussion.
Yeah, this is developmental.
And we're talking developmentally. And someone who's done thousands and thousands of evaluations on these kids, you can sit there and see that there, as Rob's talking about, you'll see that difference in hitting midline. That the hemisphere that's processing at a faster rate is going to drive that contralateral limb in a faster way, and you'll see it in the upper extremity, and you'll see it in the lower extremity. And so that's why the brilliancy of the long form that you did was at the end sit there and go, okay, let me add up the differences from right to left, or upper body versus lower body,
bilateral.
Mm-hmm.
or the bilateral, and especially the bilateral. I mean, the bilateral ability to sit there and go, okay, hey, can I time with my right hand and then alternate to my left hand? It was just something that was so dramatic, and then be able to sit there and go, okay, now apply the Melillo method protocols, change the integration, change the timing rate of the brain, and then 12 weeks later or whatever interval we choose to look at it, see that difference in that timing. That's what makes, to me, it has always made this technology the most powerful.
Yeah, people, come to me all the time, and Peter, and with tools. Oh, this is a great tool. It can do things. And one of the first things I ask is there any normative data and research? If there's no, then don't even bring it to me, right? Until you have that. And then the other thing is, well, is there an initial assessment that I can use as a comparison?
As a pre and post.
Which has to be based on some
Normative
sort of normative
Empirical,
data. Which should have a developmental trajectory to it, meaning that it's normative data for this child or this age, and that grows through the adult. And if you don't have those things, then the tool doesn't really have any value to me, because how do I know if it's actually working? And there's so many tools out there now that people are talking about and saying that, oh, I use this and I use that and I lay on this infrared mat and I do this. And there's no normative data. There's no research. There's no way of assessing where are they, and where are they down the road. And, so it may help. It may not help. It may make things worse. But if you can't measure it, it has no value. So that's why right from the beginning, when I found the Interactive Metronome, I was like, wow, it has normative data, and it has an actual assessment, and we can redo that assessment, and we can redo it in a fairly frequent level, and it's accurate. That was a really valuable tool, but there's so many tools out there that don't have that.
Well, one of the things I want you to ask you today, when I got your attention here, is we did a podcast on the Harvard study, right?
Yes.
And it had great outcomes. It showed that it needs more research. It needs to be further understood. And someone should go out there and get a big NIH grant, right? Because this is important stuff.
Absolutely.
But I would like to hear you talk a little bit about what they saw in the fMRI, because I think that's like the first time in all this research we have. You can go back and look at all the stuff we have, which is all over the place. I've never had where we actually had a physical, you could see there was a physical change. Like the brain physically could be seen changing with enough reps.
Right. Yeah, so, with all of this, and I've always been on a mission to do the research and, prove what we're doing, but really to, advance science. And so several years ago, I was invited to speak at MIT. That's an interesting story for another day. But it was really their artificial intelligence department, and the head of it had read my textbook. And he was like, we don't know why we can't create a computer that thinks like a human brain yet, but it has to do something with embodiment, with having a physical body. And we don't know why. But in my textbook, talking about evolution in brain and development of timing and bipedalism, he said, I think there's an answer in here. So anyway, I went there. 2 Harvard researchers showed up. That were associated with McLean Hospital. One's a psychologist, one's a psychiatrist. And they came in, and one was a father of a boy with ADHD, and that's why he was there. And the other was a really well-known psychiatrist who had, done a lot of work on looking at hemispheric work and brain asymmetry. And they invited me to come and speak at their lab, which was at McLean Hospital, which is the #1 mental institution in the United States, and a lab that had been there for almost 30 years, I believe, headed up by an incredible researcher named Marty Teicher. And the lab was the developmental biopsychiatry lab. And so they invited me to come up and present my work and my research. They thought it was really cool and that they should hear it because they had agreed with a lot of that, and they had done even some of this research. And so I called Peter up and I said, hey, you got to join me for this. And then my research partner, Jerry Leisman, came with me, and we went in there and we had a day and we sat and we really talked and presented everything. And they really resonated with it. They were like, wow, because they said, we've actually done a lot of this research. We know this stuff. And what you're talking about, like hemispheric balancing and timing, and we're right with you. Like, you're absolutely right. But what we've never seen is anybody that came up with a solution of how to change it. And what you've just told us is the first thing in 30 years that makes sense, because basically we know that medication works for symptoms, but it doesn't change timing in the brain. It doesn't do that, right? Nothing else does. Nothing else works. Nothing else changes that we've looked at. So any type of treatment that we've looked at, it doesn't really change the core problem, but what you're talking about makes sense. So we want to study this. We want to do an independent study. And so at the time, we were a new company. We didn't have a lot of money, and so I said, okay, how much, what look in, and so where the funding going to come from? So we looked at different funding sources, whatever, but different things. But also just, I thought, and one of the researchers, Leslie Weiser, said, I really like that interactive metronome tool, because he had started now doing my program with his son. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know what, that's a good thing. Why don't I suggest to them that they bring Interactive Metronome in on this, mm-hmm. right? And we do that with my work and my program with Interactive Metronome. Yeah. And that's when I called you up and I said, hey, you want to be involved in this? And you said, yeah, I'll give them the equipment and whatever. And it was an independent study, so it was independent of us. We didn't have any control over what their findings were going to be or anything. We just aided them in how to do my method and how to do, your program, and we trained them on that and gave them tools to do that. Peter and I created a video for home usage for the subjects, and they did this study, which was essentially a 15-week study, and they were looking at primarily boys that were at a certain age, and they had half of them were medicated, half of them were not medicated, and they all had a diagnosis of ADHD, true ADHD, which we'll go on and talk about what that means at another point. A lot of people use the term ADHD, but they don't know what it is actually neurologically in the brain. Almost all kids with real ADHD, type 3 or type 2, it's really a right brain deficiency and overactivity in the left, and they agreed with all of that. So anyway, what they did was they did this brain imaging, and as you know, that there was a thing called the Human Connectome Project, which was like the Human Genome Project. Mm-hmm. And so trying to develop like this connectome map in the brain, like, a model of how does the brain connect? What's the white matter connections look like? What's the wiring map of the brain, basically? And there's, I think, 6 facilities around the world, and they were one of the facilities. So the machine they used was like, cutting edge. Mm-hmm. It was the best machine in the world. And so they did a battery of neuropsychological tests and something that they had developed called a quotient machine, which was a way of really identifying ADHD, which was using a psychological measurement, but also what they did was they used infrared cameras to measure the amount of movement of the head in the body. And they used both of those things together, and they had the most accurate way of diagnosing ADHD. Mm. And so these kids went through the program, and then afterwards they were retested and they were re-imaged. And what they found was that there was a significant difference. And what they did, by the way, also was the kids that were medicated 24 to 48 hours before they were retested and initially tested, they were no longer on the medication. So the medication wasn't having an effect, right? So we wouldn't say that, oh, they were better or worse because one was medicated, one wasn't.
Right.
At the time of the testing, before and after, they were all unmedicated.
Right.
And so it was apples to apples. And what it showed was that there was a significant difference, that there was a difference that was even beyond what was seen with medication, as far as their improvement in attention and focus and in these objective measurements. But one of the things that really stood out for me, I remember when they brought me into the lab at one point to show me these results. They showed me this quotient machine, which they had developed. And they showed me, where it measured the attention part, but then it also measured the hyperactivity part. So it literally was this kind of grafting that measured how much motor movement there was. And kids with with ADHD, they move more and they see it on the camera. Mm-hmm. And they have normative data as to how much someone should move at different ages. And then they have also the measure for attentiveness. And they showed that, they compared medication to the study that they were doing with our tools. And they showed that it was pretty comparable with what medication did for the attention part and what our program did for the attention part, right? Like it got better, a lot better. But the big difference, and I remember looking over at Marty Teicher, and he had actually a smile on his face. And Marty doesn't smile all that much. He's a very serious guy.
Serious guy.
And I looked over and I was like, I wasn't quite sure what I was looking at and but I knew that it was something because this guy had a big smile on his face. And he said, look at the motor score. And I looked at it, and he said, we have tested everything, every drug, every procedure, anything you can imagine. Nothing has ever changed the hyperactivity, the motor hyperactivity, the amount of movements that we record on an infrared camera. Nothing has ever touched that. In this program, this was early on, this was like halfway through the study, they said, not only did it change it, it normalized it. And he said, we have never seen anything like that before. And that's when I looked over and he had a big smile on his face because he was like, this is incredible. So, it was a really substantial thing. I mean, you're talking about, major players and doing that study independently. And
what about the physical changes, the network changes that they saw in the imaging? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so they saw that there were physical changes in essentially the coordination or the functional connectivity of the brain. They actually showed that some areas got bigger, like physically changed. Yeah. Right? So actually grew, like you're growing a muscle, you're using it. Yeah. And they actually showed that there was also changes in functional connectivity, and they showed that there was greater synchronization where areas in the right hemisphere that were underdeveloped came up and got faster, and areas in the left hemisphere that were overactive and created more the hyperactive movements and overactivity actually came down. Huh. And that the communication between and the white matter literally grew, got bigger and thicker and more connected. And so gray matter and white matter physically changed, but most importantly were the functional changes in things like the cerebellum and the basal ganglia and certain areas of the brain that are related to movement and cognition. And so there was an actual change in the brain, not only in the neuropsychological measurements and in the functions, but literally in not just the physical, but more importantly in the timing and the coordination and the synchronization.
Well, thanks for that.
Yep. Yeah. And that's something that medication does not do. Can't do it. So, so it's just a great tool, and there's great studies. You've also done other studies that have been pretty cool.
Sure. Yeah. Nina Kraus is one of our researchers that is forever likes our technology. She is a board member of ASHA. She's out of Northwestern University. She is one that really, how would I describe it? She's pretty cutting edge as it relates to how kids hear with an impairment in particular. She's got a machine, literally, that it's all these electrodes that go on the head, and I can't describe how it works and why it works, but it seems to be very interesting to the NIH, and of which she's a board member of.
Is it QEEG? Is it EEG?
It's her thing.
Is it like
it's
a
like
cap?
It's a cap with lots of connections, more than I've ever seen.
That's QEEG. That's what we use that in our office, and we use it in our research as well too.
She can play back what the kids hear. So let's say you hear a song, and then the machine captures how that kid is listening to the song. Wow. She can see the millisecond delay from what the real, here's the song. Yeah. Here's the pitch, it goes up, it goes down, there's a timing, there's a lot of aspects to what you're hearing. Right. And she can show, model, overlay the two waves and show how the one kid's not hearing like the other.
Right, so she's probably using some brainstem auditory evoked potentials where you can play a sound and then you can actually measure how long it takes from the ear to where it's actually registered in the brain. So you can actually see is somebody hearing it in their brain, and how fast is it getting there, and is there a difference in the right side and the left side? Which, by the way, there was a good researcher out of Rutgers that showed that kids with autism have serious delays in their brainstem auditory evoked potential. She looked at thousands and thousands, because many kids normally, when they're born, have that test to see if they're deaf. And so that, like, I think she went to Florida, and there was a database of tens of thousands, and she was able to go back and look and say, what of these kids are autistic, and was there a difference? And it showed that there was a delay. And again, that relates to a lot of my work, where she showed that it was immaturity in the development of the brainstem, which led to slowness, and that kids with autism had immature brainstems. So, she's that's probably looking at a similar thing.
Well, but she also talks about what was really cool, and this is like COVID came, and we got zero out of it. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to figure out how to resurrect it. What happened? We were one of 5 technologies that were invited by the NIH to be presented on stage at the Music in the Brain conference, which is at Kennedy, in Washington. Okay,
yeah.
And Nina presented on our behalf. Here I am having a mental block here. Who's the drummer for the Grateful Dead? Mickey.
Oh,
Hart,
Mickey
right?
Hart. Yeah, Mickey
Yeah,
Hart.
right.
Mickey Hart. He's up on there talking about how rhythm's so important to, like, how language and this and that. Kind of talking real 30,000 feet. But she got in there and started talking about interactive metronome and her observations about it. One of the things I'm not going to do justice to, but she talks about there's 2 different kinds of rhythms. So there's this one like we have, which is the consistent beat. You're planning your sequence, and you're coming around to this consistent thing. But the other one was like dun 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 kind of thing, right? Those are 2 kind of different intelligence systems that are doing those things, right? But they both have to do with timing.
Those are the 2 areas of the thalamus.
Yeah, right.
Right. So that's what we were talking about. We have an area that there's timing in the individual networks that are, related to the specific parts of the thalamus, and then there's these other waves that are non-specific, and they need to be able to come together at the right time to coordinate it all together. So,
well, she'll tell you, again, this is that domain non-specific, that when you do interactive metronome, which is the one thing, it affects both things. It affects both rhythm patterns, or both rhythm skills.
Yeah, because the main thing that will change that is movement.
Yeah.
And changing sensory movement, what
Yeah.
Peter relayed to before, is something called proprioception, and so through the cerebellum. So movement changes both of those things, and different parts of that movement as well. So so there's great tools that come in from that. So
So to be able to piggyback on that, to be able to expand the study and be able to really look at the impact of the interactive metronome on the cerebellum, because we know that more than ever, the cerebellum has all these very distinct features that are basically the baseline of all these different networks, and that's where the new phase of brain research is understanding the major networks of the brain. And now we can see through various imaging studies, okay, well, the cerebellum will fire in a certain sequence to activate this particular network or that particular network. So that would be cool, is be able to do an expanded study and with a larger amount of participants and looking at different maybe disorders. And
and the only things really, to me, even now, that really change timing is your tool and then music. So that's been kind of studied, and it's shown that music training, if someone is trained in music, that they are, and we find that, like you said, like, remember, I think Zach Brown came into one of our offices years ago and went on the Interactive Metronome. And if you've ever seen Zach play a guitar, he's unbelievable, right? He's so fast, and he killed it. We're like, what was it?
I think like his millisecond average was like 3 or 4
like
milliseconds.
Right out of the blocks.
Right out of the box.
No training.
No training.
Right, no training. Like
So he got it though right away too, didn't he? He got.
you got
He's
it.
like, I
Yeah.
understand how this thing works.
Yeah.
And then even when giving him a complex task, and then I remember the day, like it was yesterday, that he's like, all right, what else you got for me? And we'd put him on a wobble board, we put him on all these booster balls, and
Didn't
he's sitting
matter.
there. Didn't matter.
Yeah, I
His
got
timing
this.
was
He's
unbelievable.
dialed.
Yeah, he was dialed in.
Athletes are that way. You think these big jock NFL guys. We did the entire Miami Dolphins squad. They were dialed. They were just better than normal humans.
Right.
Miami Heat. We did everybody that was within driving distance of our offices down there.
Right.
So that brings up a great point, because I'm actually working with this 14-year-old girl out of Houston right now, and she's trying to be a competitive skater, and so
like a
figure skater, yeah. And so we put her on the IM, and she'd gone through some other people, and they were working with the IM, and they looked at her scores, and she was about 40 MS. And she was at one point maybe around about 100, and it came down to 40. And I said, it's not bad. I said, if we were talking about her just going out and being normal, okay, right. But here's mom and her, she puts in like this crazy schedule, about 6 to 8 hours a day of training and everything. So they reached out to me a while back, and I said, well, what do you think we can do? And I'm like, well, for you, I think we need to get her down to about probably like 15 MS and maybe even better than that. And so that's where we're at now. And but the cool of her doing this now is that she's starting to show where those 40 millisecond, her going down to like 16 or 18. I looked at it the other day, and so she just went and competed in a competition, and she's done better. And because her mom's biggest thing was that even though she would go and work out for 6 to 8 hours, that she actually had to work so much harder than all her other peers. And then there was always just these little minute timing mechanisms that were off in her jumps and everything.
Yeah,
and
couldn't,
so that's
couldn't
really,
repeat them.
Yeah, and that's back to what we were talking about earlier, that idea of being able to be on time all the time.
Yeah.
And so now that's where we're at with this. It's going to be interesting to watch over the next couple of months as she continues to do more competition. She just worked with a great coach and was just really refining her jumps and everything. But that was the biggest thing. So I personally feel that once we get that number probably down to where she's 15 MS, and I even told her it'd be awesome if maybe we can get her. So the other day she gets on there, and she was at 14.69.
Wow, that's good.
And that was over about 200 reps.
Yeah.
So at some point, she was dialed in at maybe 3 or 4 or 5, because we're looking at that average over 200 reps of 14.69.
Yeah.
So to be at that, and so her super right on percentage is the percentage of how many of those hits were dead on. Was at 60%.
Wow.
So we're talking about like these superhuman type of events that can happen with this technology.
Yeah, so the overriding thing here, to make it practical for people, what does this all mean? Purpose of our podcast here is we're really talking about the brain and health. And really from a practical standpoint, that, almost anything that is out there now, whether it's immune problems that we talk about, or whether it's mental health or learning disabilities or physical problems, breakdown of your body, really comes down to the brain. The brain is the foundation of your health, of all health, and your relationships, everything. And the bottom line is that your brain regulates everything. And what is the key feature of the brain is the timing of the brain, the synchronization and the balance of that timing, especially between networks, especially between the right and left brain. And depending on where areas of the brain are maybe overactive or too fast, and areas that are too slow or underactive or immature or underdeveloped, that balance, depending on what areas of the brain are impacted, is what produces any symptoms that you see. There's a famous guy named Tim Brown that in Ian McGilchrist's book that says that nothing in human psychology or psychiatry makes sense unless you look at it in terms of, or light of, brain asymmetry, meaning you look at that. But the key to that balance is the timing. So for anybody, for any issue, and the great thing about the interactive metronome is we have people of all different physical levels. We have people in wheelchairs. We have kids that are very, very small that sit on their parents' lap and do it. We have,
I saw it in your clinic yesterday.
Yeah, you saw it yesterday.
Yeah,
we had a Parkinson's patient. We had a patient with dementia, and we had a young, small 4-year-old child with, right? So we have all of that. They can use it. It's not something like you have to worry about an injury, that you're going to injure yourself, or that you're going to break a sweat per se, or that it's dangerous in any way. And it's not, none of that. But yet it's the single, one of the most important things you can do for your brain. And so that's why it's important to people, because this idea of doing this and being able to work on these things, and that's why things like Tai Chi work, it's all the same type of thing. So, that kind of brings this all together. But what we want to kind of end with is you've also been a pretty successful businessman. You told us a little bit about how you changed your career and you went into this and you developed a company from the beginning, from the ground up, and you've done that, and you've done it. I've always thought you were one of the nicest guys I've ever met in business. You're ethical. You've done a lot of things that most people can't do, and success isn't always measured by the amount of sales or anything like that.
Yeah.
So what would you say for anybody out there that maybe is a young person that's an entrepreneur that's thinking about doing what you did, in your 30s, or being part of a business or starting a business? What would you say is your overriding philosophy? What have you learned? What advice would you give to somebody about that?
If it's your passionate path, which for me it was helping the Jimmy Egglestons of the world, follow that for sure. Okay, because whether it's financially successful or not, you're going to be all in. You're going to be passionate about it, right? But the other thing, I think, so remember, this company started late 90s, early 2000s, basically. It was .com. Remember how crazy .com was?
Oh, yeah.
You could raise money on an idea.
Right.
And that's basically what we did. We didn't even have 100% of product done yet. We didn't have any customers really yet, revenue, but yet people bet on this thing because they were betting on all sorts of crazy things, right? And the company raised a ton of money because the story's great. And so the company really was two different parts in the beginning. I focused pretty much on the Jimmy Egglestons, okay, and people that had a lot of pain in their life, that were really motivated to try new things and adopt, okay, when it wasn't 100% validated by science yet, or we had a couple studies, but there was, it wasn't like we are today. But then there was other part that was very aspiring part of our company, the guys that were really into sports, where we saw, again, the research was about the same. And, we had DJ Singh using it and literally in an article in the, whatever it was, PGA magazine. And we had all these sports teams. We were on, the entire Notre Dame football team used it for a season.
Oh.
And on game day, Notre Dame against Michigan, we had ESPN did like a full, 5-minute piece on us.
Wow.
With the coach talking about it. I mean, it would have been like a $2 million ad thing.
Yeah.
But we didn't have anything to sell anybody. There was no product. There was no thing.
Oh, that's funny.
And so we squandered tons of dough on this aspirational side of the house. And we didn't have the product form ready. So we had to, that was probably the pinnacle of the struggle of this business, was where we had to kind of sever. We had to go down a path. So I guess my business advice to people, when they have something like it's a double-edged sword. This thing works from people with problems to aspiring athletes, right? We were talking about, but you kind of got to pick your battles, especially when pick your lane. Resources are limited. Go prove you can do it, and stick to it. And I made bad decisions. I've made a lot of decisions like build it, they will come kind of things. Mm-hmm. Like I built that I Am Home, which you now use, probably 5 or 6, 7 years before it was time. Clinicians only know really how to charge for their services when someone walks through their door. Mm-hmm. Okay, but I made a device that the clinician, an I Am Home version of this thing, where the clinician can create a workout based on what they observe in the clinic. It can go home with the kid. Mom or someone, a caregiver, has to do it at home with the person, but the clinician is connected through a cloud system, right? And can see, is there compliance? Is the kid doing his reps? Are they improving? Maybe I need to modify. And now maybe I should contact, rather than schlepping 2 or 3 times a week to a clinic, the mom can get a call. And at the time, Zoom didn't exist.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that weren't in place yet. Yeah. But it's now, post-COVID, that's coming. Now it's happening.
Now everything's everybody wants everything virtual now.
Yeah,
everything.
Right. So that day is coming, But again, that's the other thing I was just going to say is, like, you can be you can be a visionary, and you'll build this great mousetrap, and yet people might not come.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah, but you have to have that vision. But again, it has to be something that is practical and useful, mm-hmm. and makes a difference. And like you said, I mean, nobody I've ever met that has really achieved a certain level of success hasn't failed a lot along the way, and really learned and modified their behavior and all of that.
Yeah.
So that's great. Really good advice. Really great. Good story too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
This is fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even know all this about your company, so that's why it's funny. Last night I said to Matt, he started telling his story, and I said, tell me the story because I'm dying to hear it. And he said, let's save it for tomorrow.
Exactly.
So this is the first time we're actually hearing all of this. So
we're all on the same page.
Any other, like stories or anything that you kind of think of and want to relate?
I think the future, another one of these kind of futuristic thoughts, is that not only is remote therapy going to be an important aspect. I think Medicare, I think home health is terrible in our country right now. Okay. And so a big part of our business is like, these giant rehab centers or, like Encompass Health and things like that. But KPMG called me the other day. They're going to change the way home health is going to be done, right? And so with technologies like home therapy that can be delivered by low-cost people, but that still can be monitored by high-cost people like doctors, are going to become, and there's not a lot of these technologies. We're there already, right?
Yeah.
Another thing that I'm really excited about, I'm working with a company, and they have it's a remote patient monitoring, RPM. Okay, that's the other buzzword right now that's being thrown around by these consulting companies in the medical space.
What does RPM mean?
Remote patient monitoring.
Right.
So I was talking to you about an Apple Watch that literally 24 hours a day watches the 3 things that go wrong with a Parkinson's patient, which is slowness of movement, tremor, and then whatever the result of the drugs that they're on, how it affects them. And this watch is FDA approved to measure those 3 things. Now think about how medical is done today with Parkinson's patients. They get put on meds, they go see the doctor, then they go see the doctor a month later, maybe a couple months later. What's the doctor know about that patient?
Yep.
What the patient says to him? Oh, and then if you really look, the people that are using their product right now are the drug companies, because what they look at is, if this guy takes this amount of med, this dosage at this time, what are those 3 things doing to the course of the day?
Right.
Oh my God, we got to lower the dosage and
Right.
maybe spread it out through the day, because they're getting real time. But think about how backwards our medical system is, because that same doctor, he's going to have somebody or himself stop doing people walking through the door.
Right.
And now I'm going to have to go onto a machine, go into the cloud, and look at all my patients that are out there,
Right.
and make adjustments based on this incredible amount of data that he's never had access to.
Right.
So it's going to change behavior.
And that's part of the problem right now, is because you have major insurance companies and everything. And a lot of my friends that are doctors and MDs in particular, they're being told what medications to use by some person that works for an insurance company or a nurse who's monitoring this and doesn't have their education, their knowledge, but they're just looking at the data and they're saying, oh, you have to use this medication, not this medication. And they're like, wait a second, I'm supposed to be making the decision. So there's a lot of issues.
There's a lot of issues still in that.
And even, when we talk about Parkinson's, what is Parkinson's? What is the tremor? And when we talk about someone with a tremor, people don't realize that right now my hand is here and my hand is tremoring at 8 to 12 times per second. So literally it's going like this, but so fast that you can't see it. Not just me, everybody out there, right? That's Rodolfo Linus talked about this. And again, it comes from the cerebellum. It's about 10 hertz.
Okay.
And a Parkinson rhythm is around 4 or 5 hertz, which means if you take the normal rhythm and you slow it down in half, you start to see it. And you get a tremor. So the tremor isn't something that shows up mostly and is abnormal. It's actually, in many cases, just a normal tremor that is slowed down because the timing in the brain slowed down. And that's ultimately why they move slow. Like you said, bradykinesia, the slowness of movement.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the timing in their brain, their whole brain is slow, especially on the left side of the brain.
Yeah.
So again, we could take almost any disorder that you could talk about and we could relate it into neurological and into timing terms. And then that could be related into like the immune system and the autonomic system. So there's such an overlap of all of it.
The Parkinson's study we're talking about right here, just to finish that thought, was, so we're the RTM, the remote therapy, okay, and they are the RPM, right? So we're going to combine these 2 things where most of the therapy is going to be done in the patient's home, okay, with our home product, right? And the watch is going to be watching them, okay?
Yeah.
The watch is going to be measuring what's going on. Because here's the thing. We're like a drug company in a sense, but we're not pharma. And I think the carryover, what we observed anecdotally when we've had studies in the past, is that people who do interactive metronome that have Parkinson's, kind of mid-level Parkinson's, there's a carryover that lasts some period of time. And it probably is contingent on how much dosage they get of IM.
Mm-hmm.
But so if they do IM, all of a sudden they're get up and going, right? They're able to go up the stairs and shower. They're able to have a dinner. And we don't understand that relationship because we never had a machine, a technology that can measure that effect and what that carryover is.
Right.
I'm really excited about that.
Yeah.
Actually, I think that's cool.
It's very exciting. So, again, we want to thank you for spending this much time with us and telling us. People want to find out more about Interactive Metronome or you. Where do they go?
InteractiveMetronome.com. That would be my best, you know.
Okay. And they can just go on there and go on your website and find out all information.
You'll find a lot of stuff.
Or, go to a local practitioner like there's OTs, PTs, speech therapists,
yes,
chiropractors.
You go to there's a part on our website is called Find a Provider, and you can type in your zip code and you can see everyone who's gone through our training, and that includes people from other countries. We got all the different countries,
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, it's great. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun, really enlightening, and hopefully a lot of people got out of it. What'd you think, Peter?
I thought we did a good job.
Knocked it out, huh?
All right.
Try to take something complex and make it simple. So not too bad.
Go back outside on the hot streets of New York City. We have a course to do this weekend, but thanks a lot, Matt. It was great meeting you. Look forward to working with you, and I hope people really seek you out. It's a great tool. It's incredible, and
you've always believed in
improvement.
it. And that means a lot.
Not blind belief.
No.
It's after literally. We probably have half of those million,
but
half of those uses that you have between. Because a lot of the doctors and therapists and people around the world using it, quite honestly, are because I've lectured to them, and from the very beginning they started doing this. So it's really a belief, and it's something that really works. So thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Jens.
All right. We'll see you all next time. Bye.